Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to this fourth open dialogue on bioregioning in our 2025 series of open dialogues here at R3.0. And this is a dialogue on bioregioning in Australia. I'm your facilitator, Bill Bowie from R3.0, and we are really glad to have some really eminent speakers from Australia, Michelle Maloney, Mary Graham, and Kiran Kashyap joining us. And you'll be hearing more from them as we go along. Just a quick word about this cover slide. That is a graphic of green prints from Michelle. You'll see it behind her as well, and you'll hear more about that in the session. So just heading into our agenda, just an overview of the agenda here. I will be handling both our welcome and our engagement guidance. Ralph often handles that. And then I'll do a little bit of context setting about this series and about this session in particular. Then actually Michelle will introduce Mary as our first speaker, and then Michelle will be our second speaker, and then Kiran will be our final speaker, each for about, say, 15 minutes or so. And then we will move into, in the second hour of our time together, we will move into facilitated dialogue, and then I'll close things out with a little bit of information about next dialogues and other events that you can participate in through our R3.0 series. So that's the plan for today. A little bit of engagement guidance. So we would just ask you, sort of standard Zoom hygiene, if you will. If you could stay on mute so that we don't get cross talk and cross sounds. But we do welcome you to keep your cameras on. We find that really helps to humanize this space, but totally understood if you can't do that. As for questions, you can please ask your questions in the chat sidebar whenever they occur to you. So we'll curate these questions to cover in the facilitated dialogue segment. So, and that'll be my responsibility. So we may summarize and cluster some questions just for efficiency, but we may also just ask you to go off mute and voice them themselves. So in that instance, we just ask you to respect everyone by keeping your questions succinct, on topic, so no going off on tangents that aren't really about this session. And also, of course, please be respectful. No ad hominem attacks. That has never been a problem in these sessions, but we just say that up front just in case something does happen. Also, we would ask you to add comments and resource links to our Open Dialogues Google document. We do this to, in part, try to cut down on the distractions in the sidebar. Often we'll find that there's sort of as robust a dialogue happening in the sidebar. For some people that works, but for other people, it's very distracting. So we're experimenting with a solution to that of having an off-site Google document. The other thing that this really helps is that then we don't lose these resources to the chat when it disappears at the end of the session. It's a living resource. And in fact, we do it for all of the dialogues in one document. So if you want to, please add your name before your contributions if you wish to identify that contribution with yourself. And so finally, we record these sessions for public posting on our Open Dialogues landing page. This is a resource that I'll share in the sidebar for you to navigate to, or the Google document in the sidebar when I go off share. So that's just sort of some general guidance around our process here, pretty straightforward stuff. And then I just want to give you a little bit of background about these this series of open dialogue sessions before I give a little bit of background about this particular session and then jump into it. So thank you for your patience as I give this background. So our open dialogue series was launched in early 2024, and it was just a response to popular demand for a space to delve deeper into collective sense making and understanding. Literally, I posted a link to a scientific study on LinkedIn, and one of our community members said, "Hey, I'd love to talk about that. Why don't we, gather together a group?" I said, "Sure, that fits with how we do things at R3.0." And so we had a dialogue. I think about 40 or 50 people showed up. And so we've been doing it on about a monthly basis ever since then. In 2024, we had 2 sessions that were focused on bioregioning. One session on the roots of bioregionalism with Anna Ruiz-Diaz, David Henke, Laura Curry, and Tad Montgomery in June. And then we had those 4 back, and we bridged between the waves of bioregioning with a current wave represented by Melina Angel, Joe Brewer, Samantha Power, and Daniel Christian Ball in July. Then in 2025, we launched our series that is exclusively devoted to bioregioning. So this year and really going forward, these sessions are devoted to bioregioning exclusively. So our first session in January was the histories of bioregioning with Lila June Johnston, Brandon Letzinger, and Carrie Crisp. Our second session in February was on bioregioning and permaculture with Elias McCatcher, Blar Matakuza, and Julie Davidson. And last month, we featured the South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group with Ashish Kotari, Nisha Mary Palus, Sonam Chodan, and Uttam Lai. And so that gives you a sense of the sessions that we have featured up until this point. And we will continue this series. I'm going to be announcing our next session at the end of this session. We're just nailing down details on that. And so I want to very briefly introduce this session just by saying that when this series started, I really felt like it was important that we get a global sense of the bioregioning movement. What some folks might call bioregional Earth. That's a term that the Design School for Regenerating Earth has been using, but really sort of a global tapestry of bioregional initiatives that are happening across all continents at this point. And so that's one reason why we featured this South Asia Bioregionalism Working Group. Really high on my list was Australia, in particular because of really connecting with Kiran when he published his PhD dissertation, doctoral dissertation. I looked at it and I was blown away at the high quality of that scientific work that Kiran was doing, and saw that bioregionalism played a key role in that. And so that really inspired me to think in terms of, well, how could we start to encapsulate some of the work that's happening on bioregioning in Australia? Kiran connected me with Michelle. We had a great first conversation, and the pieces were really falling into place at that point. And in this conversation with Michelle, she introduced me to the work of Mary Graham, and I couldn't have been more excited about this particular lineup of folks for this particular session. So I think that gives enough just background on what we're doing in this session. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to introduce Mary Graham, and you'll see there briefly, what it is that she'll be talking about. So Michelle, over to you to take the intro for Mary, and then go into your session after that.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. So I'm Michelle, as Bill introduced, and I might just take over the share screen if that's okay. I have some slides for Mary and myself, but I'd like very much to introduce our session. It's a real honour to be here with Bill, and I know that the connections we're all building together are so important, and I'm looking forward to the long term of working and collaborating. In our talk today, Mary and I have been working together for a number of years. Mary is highly accomplished in her fields of work and analysis, and our talks actually dovetail with each other. So, in a moment, I'll introduce Mary and I'll acknowledge country. But what Mary will be talking about is what I personally refer to as one of the oldest bioregional legal and cultural governance systems in the world. And for me, as a non-Indigenous Australian, the insights, knowledge, and wisdom from these ancient and continuing systems are profound and important, and the way for our future as well. And then what I'd like to do is give an overview of bioregioning in contemporary Australia. I had imagined we'd have folks in different parts of the world in this call, which we do. So I'll be sharing a little bit of an overview of Australia's colonial history and some of the Western science and what it says about this continent, and then looking to the future, some of the work that we and others are involved in. And that segues beautifully to Kiran's fantastic work with Regen Sydney and beyond. And I'm very much looking forward to Mary and Kiran's discussions. Um, what I would like to do personally is acknowledge country. For those in Australia, you know this, and for those in other places, you have your own process. Particularly as a non-Indigenous person, it's very important to me to be able to acknowledge that the lands of the peoples on who I live were never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal lands. I'm in a place north of Brisbane in the modern map, and this is the lands of the Cubby Cubby and Jinnabara traditional custodians. And again, for those who are overseas, this is just one snippet of the beauty across this continent. These are called in English the Glasshouse Mountains, but they have a beautiful, deep, deep story about obligation to people and land from the Jinnabara peoples. So with Mary's amazing introduction to the relationalist ethos and the constructs of Aboriginal Australian governance, we'll be able to see that bioregioning in Australia cannot exist as a new thing, in a vacuum, or even just in Western science. We have to find futures that bring non-Indigenous governance into right and proper relationship. So in acknowledging country, Mary's map that she speaks to is right here. But what I'd like to do now is introduce Mary Graham. Mary is an esteemed thinker, writer, and acknowledged as someone who's been working for many decades on sharing deep information about the First Nations of this continent and their governance systems. Mary's an adjunct professor at the University of Queensland in political science, a prolific person in terms of publications and public speaking. If you Google her, you will find her. And she's a Kombu-merri person from the Yugambeh Language Speaking Peoples. And Mary can, of course, introduce herself, but as a sign of deep respect, I wanted to be the one to introduce Mary and hand over to you, Mary. So thank you so much for being with us today. Oh, and you're on mute, Mary.
Right. Okay. Oh, good. Okay. Well, that map. Do you want to bring
I'll bring
the
it
map
back
again? Yep.
Yeah.
So Australia, as you can see, from our point of view. Sorry, first of all, I'll just introduce myself in the way Aboriginal people introduce themselves to each other, basically. So I live here in my father's people's country, and that's what we all together call our own particular place, country, region, if you like. As you can see, the whole country is full of the regions. So this is my father's people's country, Yugambeh Language Speaking Kombu-merri mob. So our particular family clan group is Kombu-merri right here on the Gold Coast, which is a big tourist place in Australia, old tourist place. Lovely beaches and all that. And my mother's people are Waka Waka, who she came from a place 400-500 kilometres northwest of here. So that was her country. So looking at country and looking at region is like, another way of saying it is they're our ancestral lands, like those mother's ancestral lands, father's ancestral lands, and so on. So place is extremely important, extremely important. Everybody has a place where it's basically the meaning of life in a sense. And there's all kinds of various takeaways, or sorry, not takeaways, throwaway lines, I suppose, or terms that we use to describe this. For example, the law, the land is the source of the law. I don't know how you'd say that in Western law, what its source is, but Michelle later will probably explain that. So essentially, if I could just say it straight off and then expand, so go from the general to the specific. The best way to describe our system is it's a sacralized, ecological, collaborative, self-regulating stewardship system. So we're stewards in that sense. And in a sense, that's the meaning of life kind of idea of your relationship with land and with each other. So the relationalist kind of notion, there's two kind of notions essentially, and they're not either or, you know, not excluded middle. Relationalism and survivalism. The first is the most basic meaning of what survivalism is. Basic as in large things that you want to escape from, like volcanoes and earthquakes and poisonous things, you know, you have to be on the run and so on. So a very essential survivalism. But then it goes into relationalism and survivalism. And the first relationalist cab off the rank, so to speak, is that the land has invented. So it's a relationalism. The land itself creates everything, absolutely everything. You know, not just the land itself, the environment, everything that lives and moves and flies in it, and so on. But it gave birth to us too. You know, so that goes on. So our relationship is it has invented us. It looks after us. It continues to look after us. And at some point or other in our long development, what somebody called a friend of mine called this is a long-term experiment in human automaking, basically, our old system. So it says looked after us. So we're obliged to look after it because we wouldn't be around. We'd be floating in space, you know, wouldn't be anywhere. If we were there, you know, if it was different. So from there, a whole social and political ordering system comes. So the idea of looking after something outside of ourselves, and that's the land itself. So we share several things with everything else, all other life forms. We share physicality and spirituality, regardless of what the science says. The majority of the world's population believes in something to do with spirituality or the spirit. So physicality, spirituality, your feelings, sentience. Sentience is your feelings, and conscious, we communicate with each other. And then, of course, instinct. Those 5 things we share with other beings. The one thing we don't share is as far as I'm aware anyway, of what do you call it? Reflectivity. You know, I often use the term of little koala bears, which we call bawbies in our language. You can't imagine them sitting up in a tree discussing the meaning of life, of course. Only we do that, besides sitting in trees or whatever. So we have this system. It's a system that isn't religious. It's not religious. It's not philosophical. It's not ideological. It's not philosophical in the European sense, meaning you philosophize about a whole thing. There's a German word called Weltanschauung, and it's what a worldview essentially is. And this worldview, though, is from a particular region. your country is a particular region, whatever its shape, like you see in that map. So we are who we are, and it's called something. The backing of it, or the naming of it, is a particular dreaming story. And there are several, but some are more important than others. So certain things are very important. And you could say this, and people do, they use a particular word for us here. So Danganbullen is our, it means the land of 5 rivers, but it's a practical physical region, but it contains essentially the meaning of life in this region, and the meaning of life with the land and with each other. So in that sense, there's no notion of a God. It's not a hierarchical kind of system. No God, no heaven or hell. That doesn't exist. And why it's not a religion is that you don't have to have faith in the dreaming to know what this dreaming is, because it's to do with reality around, actually, all around. And it's been developed over a very, very long period. It's a society of great age, and they're still finding out a whole lot about what Aboriginal people know in scientific terms too, a bit like your Native American native science idea. We've got the same thing here. And of course, a lot of old cultures have exactly the same kind of thing too. So the system that came out of here, the governance system, what you would even call a relationalist system, a relationalist sovereignty, if getting more into modern politics and so on. But not if I can say, an absolutist idea of sovereignty. So it's not about owning the land, and it is also not necessarily, like a lot of people have said, or we used to say, older people, that the land owns us. Do you know what I mean? But it is a relationalist idea. So you're obliged to look after every aspect of it. And of course, that's the setting or the blueprint or whatever, however you like to call it, the guide to the kind of society you're going to have. You're supposed to look after people, looking after something outside of the self, outside. So that's why it's not religious. It doesn't rely on faith at all, none at all. What we're supposed to be doing is looking after the place. So our own old idea contains things like, and each particular thing I could go into much more length about explaining it. So, for example, the relationalist idea is that the notion of understanding human nature and all of its flaws and good things has been pretty well worked out for Aboriginal people. For example, conflict over a vast period of time. The idea of regionalism is exactly that, actually. We are all looking after bits and pieces of this whole big country, and yet there's no notion of a nationalist idea at all. It's all regionalism. You could call it a state, the earliest form of any kind of state, but of course we don't call it a state because the notion of a state or a region dominating everybody is not there. So it's not a hierarchy, in that sense. It's flat. That idea. It bears odd how can you put it? Similarities, I suppose you could say, to a bit of to anarchy. It's been called anarchic because don't believe in government, don't believe in hierarchies, there's no such thing as these things. But of course, it's anything but anarchic in the revolutionary way. It is, the law is, if you like, a meaning of, it's also a basic meaning of life kind of stuff. So 2 different kinds of laws, the laws that are LAW, the rules, and then LORE, there is the great creative narratives of every place and all the people in every place. Great creative narratives. So the law, the LAW is the rules, and the LORE is the story about how those rules came about, basically, and you adhere to them all the time. And this idea of looking after land is definitely part of the law in that sense. So you are either lawful or not. You have to do the right thing by the land and so on, and therefore by through and to each other. So that is, in a nutshell, is called autonomous regard, because all of us are autonomous beings. We're autonomous. We are our own boss. It's not the autonomy that says, I am a law unto myself. So you're not an individual on your own who can do what he or she likes to each other and to themselves and to the land and so on. So an autonomous regard is that you are in the most basic way equal to each other. We are all equal, and that's exactly how, according to the law, you're supposed to treat people. So it's not just for people who like each other. It's for people who don't like each other. This system, autonomous regard. So you may not like them, your neighbour, and so on and so on. But or to put it another way, you don't literally have to love your neighbour, but don't go around invading him and trying to take over his land. And this brings us to the other notion about trying to understand conflict or understanding conflict. Conflict will always be with us in our idea, and of course everybody understands that across the world in different cultures. You work out ways of how do you try to obtain a measure, pretty big measure hopefully, of stability. So you don't look at security first, security against the neighbour or the others, but you look at relationalism and stability. So in order to get security, you pay as much attention and in your life and in your system to relationalism, to how to treat one another, and so on and so on. So that idea of conflict, humans being as complex and ornery as they are, they'll fight about all kinds of stuff, and the idea, the old Aboriginal idea, is you can fight on top of the land, but not over land. So there's no notion. It's a completely incomprehensible idea of invasion. It's not even in the language. The word for invasion is not in the language. But there's every different kind of conflict you can think of. Kill, murder, attack, duels, feuds. There's words for those, but no word for the classic invasion: invade, conquer, and subjugate. So that's also why there is no such thing as wars or conquest. Nothing like that at all. It's just simply, it would be, if there was a notion of it, which we only discovered came in as a new thing from colonization, of course. But nobody could understand it at first, because it's such an ancient system of this regionalism that you can't understand how someone can come in and take over somebody else's land. It's absurd. It's an absurd idea, from our point of view. Do we all want stability or not? And so on. So we're obliged to, in this system here, everything starts with the land itself and the land of your particular place. So it's highly likely they're thinking now, because I do work with mainly in the political science area, political science and international relations, but also I work with a group at UQ, University of Queensland Philosophy Group too. So the idea is work out essentially the meaning of our relationship with land itself, and you're heading towards, in this long development, we head towards the idea of, in a sense, what kind of a human being, what kind of a life form are we? Are we going to be? Are we? Were we? Are we? And so on. So the idea of looking after something outside of ourselves should lead us towards the idea of seeing a conscience or ethics, if you like. There's a word proper that we often use, Aboriginal people, of all the, we all have different popular English words that we use. The idea of proper, it's a kind of a mixture of a righteousness and the idea of, I can't explain it properly. It's a bit like Weltanschauung, which Germans also can't explain properly because it's a deep concept, a very deep concept, So you're learning not so much how to be a good person, but to understand that being fully human means having a measure of this conscience, which leads to ethics, which leads to ethics being a doing thing. You can have ethics, all the ethics you want in books on shelves and written about and spoken about, but in the end, ethics is a doing thing. So you have to have a measure of a conscience below that in order to have ethics, in order to develop a system of ethics, and so on and so on. And for us, now people don't talk like that. They'll talk about, they don't use terms to do with philosophy. They'll use these terms of proper. You have to do things in a proper way. And it's at all levels, all degrees. When you're very young, as you know, probably, your parents are telling you how to do something properly. If you can't do it properly, well, don't do it at all, or something, some scolding kind of thing. And then as you're growing up, you're realizing that it means much more than that. So looking after, like the tiny toddler is told to look after this puppy now, and you've been given as a present. You've got to look after it and feed it and give it water and stuff. Well, just imagine a system like that goes on right to adulthood, all your life and through generations. You're being told this. You not only you cease being told because now you do it actually, and so on. So again, it's not the idea of trying to be good and be rewarded in heaven, because there isn't any heaven. There's nothing like that. You're not doing it to be perfect. So proper doesn't mean perfectionism, nothing like that. And all I could go on forever about that kind of the whole old system. And of course, you can imagine after the last 200 years of colonialism, a lot of it has been turned on its head and destroyed. And but there is still a very close abiding with this kind of old ideas, So I'm not quite sure how I'm going for time.
I think a couple more minutes. Is that right, Bill?
A couple more minutes? Yeah.
Yeah, but obviously we'll have a lot of time for further discussion too, Mary.
Yeah, please ask more questions, because it's an enormous thing to try to get around. Because as you're aware, nothing's written down. There's paintings, there's in stone walls, and so on and so on. But of course, there's storytelling and your actions themselves, of course. But there's I've had a go at over the many years of looking at other people's culture, reading and trying to understand. And one thing I learned a great deal from all of this, including Western philosophy too. But I was very taken with all the whole realm of Asian thinking and philosophizing. And I came across this very interesting little term that as Chinese, space is freedom and place is security. I thought, oh, that's interesting, because that fits straight in, especially place with the region. We haven't got super observational skills that we can see, 100 miles or 1,000 miles away, but we can see next door. Do you know what I mean? We can see closer in. And so as far as that observation and connection goes, relationalist connection, you work on that. You work on that for forever and ever. You have all these rules, ways of doing these. How to manage conflict is a big one. How to think of very clever, very thoughtful ways of managing conflict, not solving it, in a sense. Sounds a bit strange. So you don't go for solutions, you go for management. manage those things that are flaws in human beings. That's the most that you can hope for, you can expect. So no hierarchy, it's a flat system, a balanced, gender-balanced governance, settlement of conflicts, getting better and better at it over tens of thousands of years we're talking about. And the whole thing is disrupted by people with a very different way of running a country. So what we're trying to do always is not just like, not all of us are relying or hoping for a treaty or anything like that. We thought it was, it's a disappointment, you know, the only English-speaking country in the world, common law country in the world that doesn't have a treaty. But Western politics can't be totally relied on, because next door neighbour, New Zealand, their old treaty was just recently chucked out by a new party coming in and so on. So life is very uncertain. And of course, the strange thing is that that's our logic too. Our logic is not Aristotelian. It's not Aristotelian. We're probably closer to Chinese logic than anything else. But ours is about all perspectives are valid and reasonable. And that needs to be explained further too, because it sounds great, but actually it's very oblique kind of thing. The logic. All perspectives are valid and reasonable, but not necessarily right. And that's where the problem comes in. If somebody of a particular kind of perspective of life tries to force their way of thinking on you, well, bad news. It's bad news. So we don't have that kind of logic. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
I was actually just turning the map off, Mary, so we could see you, because you've been very small for the whole time. But yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Mary. And
All
I'm
right.
sure people will agree that these insights into the deep ways that Aboriginal peoples have not just built their laws out of country, but built their laws with each other to do the right things, to do the proper things at all times. It's a really different way of thinking to many of the Western modes of governance, which is what I will sort of talk a little bit about now, if that's, yeah. And I always have questions for Mary. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I should have added right at the end there that our system is very, it is similarity with other Indigenous people around the world. You know what I mean? But quite often, you know, and especially Native Americans, Canadians, you know, of course, Maoris in New Zealand and so on, and the Pacific too.
Michelle, but before you get started, thank you for doing that transition. But if we could just pause for a moment and give some gratitude to Mary for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Mary, and maybe even a pause to let that sink in before Michelle goes. If we could just give a moment to leave that, let that be, and sink into our consciousness. Thanks, everyone. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for doing the pause. Mary and I have been doing so much speaking together lately that I'm watching the time without having the time to relax. So I enjoyed that moment of contemplating. And I have many questions for Mary every time we talk and work together. I can't say enough for how much I've learnt about these issues. So thank you. I'm now going to continue sharing our slides and kind of build off from Mary's hinting at what happened 230 years ago. So hi everyone, Michelle Maloney. I grew up and was born on Inangai country, which is right out in the outback, central western Queensland, a place that's very flat, and water is something that falls from the sky a couple of days a year, but not every year, every couple of years. So I grew up in the desert, semi-desert, and as a young non-Indigenous person very aware of the Irish connections and the colonial story of my peoples coming to this continent weren't taught to me. So I always like to acknowledge that I'm certainly of a generation where I had to find out the truth about the country myself as someone 18, 19, 20 years old, learning at university and being shocked about the history of our country, the legacy that hasn't been opened up and discussed properly in this place, and what that means for my area of interest, which is governance, which is how we organise ourselves, but it's within parameters of what Mary's talking about. You know, I say it as how do we be good earthlings in this place, wherever we are. And in my case, I'm incredibly grateful to have been, for better or for worse, in terms of the history of the continent, someone who was born in Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the Inangai folks and the ancient continuing culture that people have out where I'm from as well. So what I'm going to talk about in my 15 minutes or so, as I've already indicated, I believe that the ancient and ongoing foundations of First Peoples on this continent are the guide for the future of trying to have a livable future on this continent, given what climate change and other scary scenarios are pointing us towards. There's a lot that we need to change. In my presentation, I'm going to look at bioregioning in Australia through a couple of different lenses. The colonial history and ongoing legacy of what it means for how we govern ourselves today, and how, in so many ways, the top-down Western structures are almost like the opposite of bioregioning. And I'll talk a bit about that. I'm going to just, again, particularly for the folks who are not from Australia, I'm going to share a few maps of what Western science and Western land care movements and such, how they have classified this country in terms of its different ecosystems and bioregions. I think some of it's interesting. It's not something that we have to be concretized or wed to as human beings to govern or care for a place, but it's a very interesting show of maps that many of those maps resonate with what the first peoples of this continent worked out, which is how to be a jungle person in a jungle place and a desert person in a desert place. And I'm a self-confessed governance and bioregional nerd because I absolutely adore the opportunity, particularly from my cultural background, to re-engage the brain with what it looks like to be part of a place, not just dominating it and rolling out Western laws. So I think looking at how Western science classifies things is interesting, and it can give us a lot of insights, but there's a lot of other ways to look through different lenses. I'm only going to touch briefly on the enormous place-based community movement in Australia, which often, though, still is, I would suggest, quite anthropocentric. There's a lot of place-based work where people are trying to get more decision-making and collective power over what's happening in their place. But unlike First Nations cultures, many of these systems are not connected to the biophysical or ecological reality we live in. And that's, again, one of the reasons our system in Australia is driving us in a direction that's not good for country. And then a quick chat about some of the stuff that Mary and I work on together, and that I'm looking at through the work that we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And I don't want to be a commercial or anything, but I do, context matters. My day job is with the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and we were formed up 12 or 13 years ago as a group of volunteer lawyers who were really interested in the movement that connected earth jurisprudence or earth laws with Indigenous knowledge, and with both different ways of looking at the world, critiquing Western industrialised systems and how the root causes of the ecological problems and the social justice problems we face can be addressed. Again, what I would call through a bioregional lens.
Michelle,
The system, yep.
Really quickly, there's I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a couple of bars that are blocking the view. I wonder if you could unshare and then share again, just in case.
Yeah, that's strange. I think you're seeing the menu buttons for Zoom. That's really odd, but thank you for telling me. Because my screen is
a little
just the
bit
visual.
better.
Okay, that's what it was. Let me try again, and I'll get the bars. That's odd. Thank you, Bill. That never happens.
Yeah, I've never seen that
I live
happen
on Zoom.
either. But it
No,
seems to
thank you
make
for telling
sense.
me.
Yep.
Absolutely. So you can see it better. I'm dragging all the menu bars for Zoom out of the way. So yeah, what we're interested in is a shift from the human-centered, triangle way of seeing the world to earth-centered. And like Mary, when I touch on concepts that I'm passionate about, I can dig into some of those in much more detail, but I won't. I'll move on to the story of Australian. Oh, this is just to remind us that AELA is inspired by Earth jurisprudence, what I see as a Western deep ecology framing, which calls to bioregional responses and invites Westerners to think differently and connect again. But of course, being in Australia, profoundly influenced by the work and thinking and wondrousness of the cultures here. So the other thing I wanted to mention, because I know not everyone in the bioregioning space is quite as obsessed with governance as I am, what we look at inside AELA are the underpinning structures that guide industrial society. That's one of the things that Thomas Berry speaks to. And what I mean by governance, when I personally talk about it, is the rules that we make to live, work, and play together at every scale of human activity. And this was work that I was looking into for many years before I met Mary. And when I met Mary, it was like meeting a kindred spirit who loves governance and how we work and how we all fit together. So inside AELA, we were looking at the laws and the moral codes and the social norms in the Western systems and why they were the way they were, or why they are the way they are, anthropocentric, extractivist-focused, expansionist-focused, etc. And the history of that, it makes logical sense. The legal, cultural system that came out of Europe in the 1500s and spread across the world made sense to those people because they built it for thousands of years. But as always, all of these systems, whether you're looking at bioregional governance or critiquing an aspect of property law in Australia, all of these constructs are just made up by people for the culture and the values and beliefs. And so I love speaking after Mary because she is able to articulate how those deep parameters for First Nations peoples, Aboriginal peoples in Australia guided their actions, those cultural beliefs and understandings from thousands of years of observation, practical understanding, and spiritual awareness of the living entity of life guided the rules they made to live in a place and to care for a place. And I love it. I just love those approaches. So very quickly, for those who don't know or remember, I know that many of us are on this call from different parts of the world, some of which have a more recent colonial history than others. The modern nation state of Australia looks like this, with big straight lines. We have a number of states and we have a federation of Australia. But these straight lines are built on top of, and we have this profound debt in terms of the country was invaded and taken, the economic system that was built on top of a millennia and millennia of care. The debt that's owed has not and probably cannot ever be truly repaid, but there's much, much more we can be doing. And just a reminder to people around the world, prior to the 1500s, when the Europeans took their trade interests and turned it into something else, much of the world was biocultural. And I know we know that. We love bioculturalism. That's why we're here. But this idea of the patchwork quilt of different peoples connecting deeply to place and their cultures reflecting out of those places, it's just wonderful. So the Europeanization of the world, which started from the 1500s, and I'm a boring legal nerd. I've been analysing the history of English law as well and its impacts in Australia for a book that Mary and I are writing and I hope to have done by the end of the year. But yeah, we know that the ideas that came out of that small pocket of the planet were then spread across the world. And the British Empire, which invaded Australia and claimed it under some very erroneous legal constructs, terra nullius and empty land, because their culture could not recognise or take the time to see what Aboriginal people had. And there's a whole nother remarkable, devastating story, the story of us here on this continent, that has been echoed and repeated, obviously, in other places. But this is the map I want to just speak to for just a moment, and then I'll get into the biophysical realities of bioregional stuff in Australia. What I like to remind people is that the system that was planted in Australia when the British planted their flag, and you can see the difference, these years where different colonies were drawn on a map with big straight lines. These ways of thinking reflect both the imperialism and colonialism of the British, the simplicity of their approach to just taking someone else's place and land and turning up with a really different mindset. So compared to millennia of ensuring the regeneration of place, and ensuring human practice inside a place, what we brought to this continent was a profoundly hierarchical society, incredible map for thousands of years between the elite decision makers and the others who work for them. Top down and centralised control. And I still hear this mindset in Australia when people say the Indigenous communities didn't centralise, as if that's a deficient thing. And that's why I'm fascinated by the rise of bioregionalism now, where everyone's going, actually, when it comes to caring for the land, the top-down stuff isn't working. So the state, the military, the patriarchal laws and culture, the resource extractivism that went to the US, that went to South America, that went to so many places in the world, came here too. And we're one of the youngest colonised countries on earth. So we're 230 years of the modern, so-called modern constructs. And nature is still, in our legal and governance system, property. And all of these structures impact on the work we're all trying to do. Get Westerners or people in the industrialised society to connect with place and to think differently. And that's why bioregioning as a word, or bioregional, is it's an exciting little word that triggers people to have to think that these big straight lines might not be the best way to do everything or anything really. So just quickly, I just wanted to share this with you because I think a lot of folks who don't know Australia very well might be interested to know. When the colonisers came to this continent, it was primarily to do resource extraction. The 1901 Australian Constitution doesn't mention environment, doesn't mention community. So our so-called democracy, our representative democracy, was never designed to care for the world, to care for the living world. We have to put that aside. The mapping stuff that was happening by Western science across Australia, I'm astonished to say, to understand biodiversity, really started in the 1970s. Some of the early maps were actually all about extractivism. And Mary, you and I really must bring into our slide set the beautiful map of your Five Rivers country, which was actually done by some European folks in the 1890s. But most of the early mapping by Westerners was all about where are the minerals, what's the stuff we can use. Since the 1990s, IBRA 7 shows us Australia has, Western science says, this is just Western science, 89 bioregions. And by that, they define a bioregion as pretty much from the geology up, you know, the kind of geological and then the predictive qualities of what we can do with vegetation, not what we can do, what kind of vegetation we can expect. So about 89 bioregions and 415 sub-regions. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at that sub-regional map, it looks a lot like the Aboriginal map of Australia. It's not the same, but I find Western science is often joyfully trailing behind 60,000 years of knowledge that the first peoples worked out. But these systems are really interesting. Now, this is actually a really rough map of catchments, the big catchments, and then there's little catchments. I know in the US, you guys call them watersheds. So if you look at from the geology up, the vegetation up, you know, 89 bioregions broken into lots of little sub-regions and then ecosystems. But if you look at the river systems, where all the rain drains into, these are the huge catchments that inside each one have their little sub-catchments. So just a reminder, Mary's down here, south of Brisbane, down the Gold Coast. I'm a little bit north, and Kiran is here in Sydney. And just so you know, in the last couple of weeks, the biggest rains ever recorded by Westerners have fallen out here in the Channel Country where I grew up. I grew up out here. And all that water doesn't go out to the ocean. It all flows to an inland lake called Lake Eyre, reflecting Australia's ancient geology and the inland sea that once covered 2/3 of this continent. Anyway, I could wax lyrical about the wondrousness of our continent for days, but I just wanted to show you that these catchments, and within each one, the catchments that exist in Australia, just in the last 20 years, Westerners have finally caught up with the idea that catchment scale management is of use. And what we've seen, actually it's more than 20 years, I'm being unfair, probably 30 or 40 years through federal government funding, we've had the emergence of funding for groups that are called either catchment management groups in New South Wales or NRM, natural resource management groups in Queensland. And the reason I mention this is what we do have in Australia is a phenomenal body of human beings across the continent, Indigenous land and sea ranges, Indigenous traditional stewardship continuing in many, many places and being reborn in many places. But we also have non-Indigenous people passionately caring for place. Wildlife carers, natural resource management groups, local land services, which are actually connected to state governments, local land care. Some of my closest friends who can handle the heat, they're out there in the summer weeding and doing wonderful things. But what we don't have is a connection between all of that on-ground knowledge and our own governance systems. It is quite remarkable. And yes, that's a koala. Isn't it cute? Mary mentioned in her language they're bawbies, and I love that. It's lovely. So this is just one example of a beautiful conference that I went to the year after this photo. But these are some of the people who are reimagining how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can work together to care for country. And these people are doing the work. They're on country. They're in their own traditional estates. They're sharing and across cultures and across knowledge. And it's so exciting. But it's not the main part of our lives in Western society. So even place-based, that's a ricali, folks. I shared this for Bill. We don't have a beaver equivalent in Australia. We don't have an animal that chews down trees because our gum trees hollow out and fall down on their own. But what we do have is something that the Europeans called everything that was small and brown a rat, which I'm sorry, but it shits me to tears. This, one of the Aboriginal words for this is a ricali, and it's a giant little creature that swims around in the water, eats up the fishes, and he's gorgeous. Look at him. So he's closer to a freshwater otter. So that's a ricali. So in Australia, we also have, as many Western countries do, financial, ecological, and social justice crises. The poor are getting poorer in a really rich country, and the rich are getting richer. So there's lots of place-based initiatives, lots of regen stuff going on, and I'm so glad Kiran can talk about the work that he's been involved in. Many of these groups are connecting to local place. Some of them are not, though. Some of them are still, what do humans want? What are we going to do in this space? And I remember Mary telling me once that one of her colleagues said, whitefellas are always about 3 feet above the ground. That everything we do is in our head. Let's draw a map, big straight line. Let's do this thing, big straight line. Whereas and even in our place-based initiatives, we're still seeing people talking about what the people want without going, well, actually, our country floods all the time, or hey, we're out in the middle of a desert. Maybe we shouldn't be pumping all our water to irrigate cotton. So lots of wonderful things going on. However, the legal and governance challenges in this modern, I always think of the modern state of Australia, kind of like concrete poured over parts of this initial remarkable continent and biocultural system, but all of the life continued to burst through and is bursting through even more in these last few decades as more and more respect for the remarkable thriving and surviving of Indigenous people despite a horrific legacy of colonial destruction, violence, and institutional displacement and racism. So this stuff has to change. So what are we doing? And I'll finish now with questions we should be asking as Australians, whatever we're up to, is what do our unique places need to be ecologically healthy? We never ask that question in our legal systems. We patch up things. We save threatened species. We stop certain pollution. If Australia and most countries on Earth in the West were looked at like a corporation, you'd wonder where the business plan is. Where the heck are we going? What are the choices we're making to build a livable future? And this is why the work that Mary and others do in sharing their remarkable system of ongoing existential metaphysical understanding of their place in the world, the shallowness of our governance, it's not a livable future if we keep thinking, not just in an economic way, but this shallowness of what we're going to do next week and how do we make sure the banking system's fair without going, who are we as human beings on this living planet? How do we on this continent best organise ourselves to thrive and care for the rest of the living world? I won't talk too much about AELA's work. As you can tell, I'm a bit obsessive. I love all this stuff. We are building a bioregional learning network simply because there's so much going on internationally and there's so much going on in Australia. We often build networks to help people connect. So that fractal thing, that's what we're up to. And Greenprints, our little humble program that is getting traction with a couple of communities despite a lack of resources, is about helping people connect all their good initiatives together, trying to learn from First Nations peoples to think about how we fit ourselves into place and what the things are that we have to change so that we can live here in this beautiful place forever. And that's me. So thank you very much. And I really hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you so much, Michelle. a little bit of appreciation for Michelle. And then I'll ask that we do the same of giving a moment to really just let that sink in before we go over to Kiran. So let's just pause for a moment. Thank you, everyone. Michelle, you had mentioned maybe wanting to give a quick introduction to Kiran. Are you still wanting to do
I would
that?
love to. I would love
Great.
to. Yes.
Thank you.
So it's always hard being the third speaker because you've been sitting there listening to us and you've probably heard our stuff before. So thank you, Kiran. I first met Kiran several years ago when we were both exploring research. Kiran and his wonderful PhD, which Bill has given credit to, and myself just trying to work out how we do green prints and how we actually help connect stuff. And I was so excited to connect with Kiran. Kiran is now one of the co-conveners of Regen Sydney, which he will tell you all about. But first and foremost, Kiran's deep understanding of the transition by design, the ideas of how we connect with other human beings to make movements happen, and his passionate interest in building a better future. I'd let Kiran introduce himself in other more technical ways about where he did his PhD and the specifics of his work, but I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you Kiran Kashyap, who is a resident of the beautiful city of Sydney. Hello, Kiran.
Hey, Michelle. Yeah, thanks for the intro and so lovely to be here. See all your faces. So much gratitude to you, Bill, for bringing us together, and Auntie Mary for really setting the scene with the compass, remembering for those of us who have a bit more of a disconnect from our Indigenous past, and Michelle for really the rigor and the nuance of the context that we find ourselves in. So hope to build on that, and yeah, really honoured to be here with you in this call. So I might share screen and get going. I'm calling from the lands of the Gadigal people here in Sydney, and that means essentially the people of the grass tree. Gadi is the grass tree here in the local language. And I want to pay respect to elders past and present here. And like Michelle was saying, you know, there's so much in doing this that we as non-Indigenous people have to learn from the ancient regenerative cultures that have been in this place for millennia. I come here as a Tamil immigrant from India when I was 3 months old, and I've grown up here since then, coming up to 40 now. And I also, I suppose, I pay some regard to the traditions that my parents have bestowed upon me. I think I learnt a lot about interconnectedness and ethics and the aliveness of the world, which then I tried very hard to unlearn through my 20s, and then now trying to reconnect with. So I'll be here, I'll be talking about my own perspective through my PhD, but largely from the perspective of Regen Sydney. And I think I'd like to start by just describing what Regen Sydney is for people who haven't heard about it, and then I'll talk more about what one particular project we're doing in a neighbourhood, and then I'll come back to connect with how we're engaging with bioregional approaches. And so a lot of the focus here will be around civic infrastructure, tapping into that flat structure that Auntie Mary described earlier, and how we can bring people who are on various parts of that journey, non-Indigenous people in particular, to come into these types of understandings, because we're the people who need to do the work. So this is the context that we find ourselves in, of course. And on the left there, you see this depiction of moving from an anthropocentrism to an ecocentrism. And I think part of that is reconciling the disconnection that has been not only imposed upon the land, but ourselves as parts of those systems. And as we try and move back into this interdependent way of life, where things aren't out of sight, out of mind, or othered, and such that we can bring and actually pay honor to the interdependence that exists, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so to do that in a conscious manner in the way that we govern and organize ourselves. On the right there, you see the effects of not doing that in a global sense, and the effects of that disconnection, the effects of not really paying heed to the types of impacts we're having socially and ecologically. So that's a map of different nation states and the level to which they've transgressed biophysical boundaries on the x-axis, and then on the y, the number of social thresholds that have been achieved. So up the top right, you see Australia, and a lot of so-called developed nations up the top right there. But where we need to be is up the top left, where those social needs have been met, but we're not transgressing those ecological thresholds. So in that context, what Regen Sydney is trying to do is to take a systemic view and acknowledge that there's no silver bullet to working through these issues, but that people need to come together across the different areas of expertise and collaborate. And so some of the goals that we've set for ourselves in this organization is to help to transition to an economy that is life-affirming, one where people who are already working towards that can be connected, and then in a generation help to move Sydney as a city and a bioregion into the safe space of the donut. So the top left of that graph that you saw on the previous page. And I suppose part of that is just to acknowledge that the donut is a model that we work with, and we see its value, but also its shortcomings. There's no perfect way that this model exists. We've adapted it to the Sydney context to capture some of the context-specific elements into the ecological and social foundation dimensions that we've depicted. But ultimately, it's a model that can act as a bridge, and we see a lot of value in that because it captures in it, especially with caring for country in the middle, some of the elements that can help people to think in systems again and also take that into their actions. And it speaks some of the language of current institutions, but at the same time holding the values of the relationalist ethos that Auntie Marion was speaking about. So it's a bridging device as a compass in order to bring people along on this journey. And so you can see, through various activities, we use it as a collaborative tool to build systemic leadership and help people to see across their immediate narrow silos. And our role is as a convener to help those conversations and engagement to happen. So the way we've been doing that in the Waverley context is based upon this view that this neighbourhood scale is really valuable, because that's where people really feel connected to their community and also to the living systems, and it's tangible, and people know their neighbours, and they might know the rhythms that they see, like here in the catchment that I'm in, when the tide's coming in or going out, and seeing the trees change and the different types of birds coming in through the different parts of the year. And I think that's why that neighbourhood scale is really, really important to help people to see how they might reintegrate into the natural rhythms again. So we're drawing from, in this work, these 4 examples you see to the right are really, really valuable precedents for us. And we'll send these slides out later, but I suppose it helps us to think about this as in a mission-oriented way. So to help build coherence across the different approaches that exist in the neighbourhood. Ultimately, what we want to do in this space is this profound shift that's not going to occur just in one project, for example, but to help people move from being passive consumers to active citizens. And I don't mean active citizens in terms of just voting every 3 years for your elected representative, but to take responsibility in being a custodian for your place, but also for your community. And I think that's a big shift. But through this kind of work, we can start to tease out people's agency in being able to do that, and also to help them find like-minded people, build a bit of a movement, and I think help people to find complementary roles in that. So there's no one way to do this. And part of that, I think, is the local councils of all colonial frames of governance do have a lot of dynamism, although they're under-resourced. But they, more than others, are taking action towards things like resilience, and especially with floods and bushfires that we've had here, quite seriously. And so there's room to build upon that language and those approaches to have a more expansive conversation about regeneration, for example. So in Waverley, we've taken that kind of approach, and halfway through conducting this program, it's designed in 3 phases. And firstly, we went to build a community of practice, and with advice from one of our advisors who was at the City of Sydney at the time, David Beaumont, he really connected us with First Nations councillor in Waverley Council, who then linked us up to many different communities of practice as well. And part of that was to bring in groups that were already working there, like Transition Bondi, there's Bondi Innovation, and different groups who are doing beach cleanups and things like that. So bringing in this diverse array of groups that already existed and teasing out what a vision for regeneration in this neighbourhood is, in their view. And I suppose in doing that, we're now in this second phase, halfway through that, where we can compare that vision for what they would like to see. And of course, that's informed by remembering what it was like before colonisation, but also acknowledging some of the structural barriers, comparing it with what council's already doing and identifying where those gaps are. And then asking the question, is there a good way to measure progress in the second phase in light of that vision? And then in the third phase, going into creating transition pathways. So I'll talk a little bit more about those three phases. So in the first bit, that was over 4 months, and it was very much trying to find this balance between a rigorous process that would have impact on the current institution, but at the same time, modeling what a regenerative culture might be, and doing that in a really convivial way through picnics and screenings and things like that. So now there's about a community of practice of about 160 people, and the vision was encouraged by considering social and ecological dimensions together. Lots of mapping activities, people coming in and finding that they were able to tap into the unique rhythms of the place, and sometimes there were frustrations about what wasn't working, but once those were aired, I think people were able to better engage and see in this collective that they might actually be able to be creative and look for solutions that might not have happened on their own. In the second phase, we are looking at this form of measurement called cornerstone indicators, and Catherine Trebek has been guiding us on this process. And the premise for this form of measurement is that often indicators and metrics used by institutions aren't legible to the public. They're really technical and jargonistic. What if there was a form of measurement that the public could get behind and could act as an interface between institutions and public in a live way? So that was the premise. So around bridging to the public and cross-cutting across different social and ecological aspects into one holistic indicator, for example. So the one you see there is quite simple. So what are the number of families who enjoy not having a car in a particular place? So that would have implications for transport, for the accessibility of services, personal autonomy, as well as for the number of emissions. So it's a cross-cutting kind of indicator. And that's the framing of that is quite interesting because it's quite accessible in its language, and people would see how it's perhaps relevant to them. So we're in this process of translating the vision that came from the first phase into cornerstone indicators such as this one. And what we hope to do with that in the next phase that's coming up in a month or two is to let people go through this process of finding a role for themselves in the transition. So the premise being, we have this vision, we have these targets, these indicators for how we might direct our action, but then now how can community collectively act in a way in key areas that complement what council's already doing and raise the ambition for what's possible. And so some of the exercises we'll be doing there, there's an activity called a live model game, and also looking at using warm data labs to form a cohesive way for people to bring together all this diverse knowledge in that context. So yeah, and lots of great kind of comments from the participants so far. There's more to go, but people, for example, Tamara saying connection to place comes from a deeper spiritual connection to nature. There's no silver bullet, and that Stabs sees that maybe there is a broader significance from this work that's happening in Waverley with donor economics. So the way we are thinking about bioregionalism in this context is, I suppose, as a nested approach. So how might we design the systems and rules that guide our social norms, economies, and institutions to be organised around not just the bio-geophysical flows, but also the socio-cultural relationships of place. So I know Michelle and Auntie Mary have touched on this really deeply, but it's just, I think it's worth emphasising that the cultural aspect and the natural aspect have always been intertwined and evolved together. And so I think in the way that we approach our work with understanding ecosystems and the flows of catchments, I think we find it really important to think of that as a dynamic that's interdependent with how humans are acting. And so I think that's the relational ethos in practice, to see both where there are issues in the way that stakeholders, institutional stakeholders in their land use practices, for example, are degrading the land, I think is part of the opportunity, because a lot of that is invisible at the moment, and part of these activities and convening are to make those invisible things visible. And so I suppose in our work, the way that we are doing that is through these three areas of work. And you see up the top there where it says neighbourhoods, it's what I just described with the Waverley project, building civic engagement. But there are two other layers of work that we're developing as well, and underpinned by this goal to build the civic infrastructure of interdependence. And in the middle there's regenerative action in thematic areas across the Sydney bioregion and metropolitan city, looking at food and river restoration. So there are experts in that area that have been working on this for decades, and we notice a gap in, of course, like I mentioned earlier, that they're not always connected up with a coherent strategy. And so that's where we think we can help to bring these unusual alliances together and to set the intention for their work and align and place upward pressure on other existing institutional layers of government. And then down the bottom there, it's around the deep economic code of this place. So working with forming alliances between academia and institutions and government to look at how can we shift away from the GDP towards something that's more holistic as a metric, because it is so pervasive in every single decision and financial institution currently. And so I think that's the challenge that we're facing in terms of having making a clear kind of ambitious goal for what's possible, but also what are some of the steps we can take along the way to do that. And so, of course, we're here in the Sydney Basin bioregion, and I think it's really important to think about, like I mentioned, the nested systems. And this table that you see on the right is from a paper written by Shan Turnbull, Anne Polina, and Natalia. And I think it's a really interesting synthesis of the different scales at which we can work, and there's no one scale that's more important than another. And of course, even when you're looking at bioregions, they're permeable as of course, even as climate change accelerates and the way that land evolves is a dynamic feature, of course. So I think there's something to be learnt, I think, for us from this table on the right. And I think the way that we connect the work at Waverley in the neighbourhood scale, for example, and then link that with our work in the Cooks River catchment, for example, where work is emerging, and then at the Sydney bioregion. And then, of course, with what Michelle looking at the more national scale and the way bioregions are emerging across the continent. So I think this table really, I think, provides a really good, foundational grounding for the way those nested systems of governance and polycentricity can emerge. And lastly, just wanted to mention this process we've got on the left there, learning from green prints as well as transition design, and it's how this co-evolution of nature and culture can be convened in collaborative settings, starting from place and working through all of the different structural elements to think about what and act on what a transition pathway is. And we're starting just to work with the Cooks River Alliance and developing work there in, this is a catchment in the southwest of Sydney. And I'll leave it there. So we're really excited to see where we can take this.
Great. Thank you very much, Kiran, for that really in-depth look at the work that Regen Sydney is doing. So thank you. And again, I'll ask folks to, that was really quite a body of information. So I think if we just calm ourselves down for a moment and take that in before we move over to the question and answer part of our session. Okay, and we've already got some really great questions in the sidebar. But please, folks, do add more questions as you go. I'm going to go ahead. We've got about a half an hour for question and answer, so I'm probably going to do some clustering, as I said I would do up front, because we've actually got some really good clusters happening. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions from Emily. So Emily Rowland asked, how do we center First Nations knowledge systems in bioregioning without extractive dynamics? And I'm going to pair that with a question from Marco Gree, which is looking at the map of Indigenous Australia, how significant and how fluid were those borders, in quotation marks, between the tribes, if that's the correct word. So I'll leave those questions for us first, and I'm thinking that Mary, giving you first chance to respond to those. And I think you're still on mute, Mary. And I'll also put these questions into the sidebar so that people can see them. I think Mary's trying to get herself off mute there. Oh, technology. There we go.
There we go.
All right.
It resisted. Resistance is useless. Yeah. Oh, look, first up, thanks for those questions. First, Kiran, I thought that was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Your explanation of that system. And very lots of similar things in there that I think of. Always trying to shorten or make it more brief, some explanations or talking about our system. It's so huge, it's so over time, all this, society of great age, having worked a whole lot of all sorts of stuff out, but I was trying to work it out into a system of working out what a coherence is for humans, with humans, for humans, among ourselves, coherence. And then the thing of proportionality as an exercise, as both as a way of thinking too, and it's a deep-seated sort of measuring of everything. Now, not just, you know, the layout of the environment, but even with feelings and emotions, measuring things. Do you know what I mean? How you work all those things out. And then predictability. What do you learn from those two things to be able to predicting different ways of having a system, a social system that people feel have confidence in. They have confidence in it, and they're comfortable. And they feel security, stability, and so on. And it's a regular kind of thing. But and I'm sorry, I forgot some of the questions. But one thing to do with governance, just as far as the lines, you know, the distinctions between in that old map. That's a white fella's map, by the way, but it's correct, but incorrect in some parts too. And all the different groups have been working on these to correct it and so. But yes, they're not borders with fences or, you know, guards at every time. They're very loose. They are. You're building on this relational sort of connection with your neighbours all the time. And when we say, as some philosophers now are here, political science people, is that it's highly likely that we probably did invent governance, the ordering of human populations into some kind of area. And of course, birthed or born into via regions. Because Aboriginal people say this all the time, that the land has created us. We've been created by the land, not some spirit figure or, you know, that you can't see or anything like that, the land. But we're not, you know, it's not a case of you worship nature or anything like that. In fact, you don't worship anything. We're autonomous beings, and nothing is transcendent over us. But you work in with the land, regions, and, you know, it answers a whole lot of things. And the essential part of that is how to get on with your neighbours and not invading one another. You know? Fighting, yes, because fighting can never get away from that. The flaws of human beings, they're so complex. Humans are complex, ornery. You know, if we weren't fighting about anything, we'd probably invent something to fight about, you know, which has happened all over the place and so on. So manage that, work out ways of managing that. And I'm sorry, what was the first question?
So thank you. The first question from Emily was, how do we center First Nations knowledge systems in bioregioning without extractive dynamics?
Yes. Well, I just think that idea of the notion of looking after, which the idea, the ways of looking after things. Like I was saying before, if you work out a coherent sort of way of the relationship between people, and what helps that is, I've always seen a conscience. A conscience is the thinking and feeling kind of idea. You know, when I first read what's her name, Hannah Arendt, trying to figure out what fascism is. You know, how did it work? She talks about different, thinking, the wrong thinking kind of idea. You know, but I think you can't go beyond like. I think that's right, but you have to add feelings and emotions with it. So, trying to work out who and what human beings are, and they're thinking about themselves and their relations with each other. So, I'm sorry, I've lost the train of my thought now.
About how
what
to
I usually
centre
say.
First Nations thinking, Mary.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
well,
perhaps,
it's
yeah.
broader than centering. It's much broader of how to. Sometimes I refer to other religions and other philosophies to the older, the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, he acts quickly to help this person who's been bashed and robbed. An ethical thing to do. But the grounding thing of it is a conscience. You have to have the conscience first. And then the ethical thing is the doing thing. You decide to do something. And where does that all come from? Do you know? So it's got to be trained. I think of it like a moral gymnasium. You have to practice the thing. Practice. Practice a conscience, how you do it. And you do that by looking after land. It's not just conservation and it's not just survivalism. It is the meaning of how you're gradually travelling towards a fully fundamental meaning of what being human actually is. We're supposed to be stewards. You can be all sorts of other things, great warriors and, inventors and everything. But the essential thing is the stewardship kind of notion, and I know it sounds, in a sense, compared to everything else, great putting rockets on the moon and AI and stuff like that, sounds sort of boring being a steward, but, feet on the ground. There's an interesting book by a French fellow, Coming Down to Earth. Can't think of his first name.
Bruno Latour.
Bruno Latour, yeah. Coming Down to Earth. I thought it's perfect. It's exactly right. You start where you're walking on something solid, and you have to have something solid, not something like you come out of your imagination, like you believe in it. And even then, you get beyond believing in it. It's just real life, It's real life. And it goes on
Mary,
from there.
could I just jump in quickly too, because of all the work you and I do together, and because we created Future Dreaming to do this centering or connecting Indigenous and non-Indigenous people's ways of looking at the world together. Perhaps the only other offering I would have is, wherever possible, reach out in your local communities to connect over the long term, build the relationships as Kiran and, doing in his work,
Exactly.
and build the relationships, get to know each other, learn the stories of the place. And if you can't do that, and you have tried, read everything you can. There is so much literature around the world by Indigenous writers and thinkers, and get to know firsthand their thinking, their ideas.
Yes.
Don't appropriate, and always acknowledge. It's a basic academic idea too. Always acknowledge where the idea came from, and you're not extracting, you're sharing. Sorry, Mary, you go.
Yeah, yes. That's why I really like that, Kiran, what you're talking about. I was really pleased to hear about, and this is from a whole groups of people, apparently, I think I'm not quite sure about in America, but in UK, the old Greek idea of sortition, of citizens' assemblies or people's assemblies. That's what it sounds like. I was very pleased when I heard about that a lot of people are working more and more towards this. And apparently this comes from millions of people who are a bit fed up with the failures of democracy, and it's not working. Can't have a democracy, millions of people homeless and, never-ending wars and so on and so on. What kind of democracy is it, So people, a whole lot of people are trying to work out ways they can work with each other to make a change. But one thing I forgot to say earlier too was if you don't have you don't have skeptical people, and nothing against skeptical people, but that's quite right that they are too. But here in Australia, and you probably have them over there, certain political types who want to say enough of all this navel gazing, get rid of it. It's not reality, and so on, so on, so on. But for those people, you could also look at our system. You're all familiar with the term fulcrum. What a fulcrum is. The old seesaw, the bar, that bar, that's the fulcrum or the pivot point, Well, the land is the fulcrum here between human beings and existence. You have to look after it. You have to look after it, but don't praise it up like it's a god or something. No, just practical. And because I always thought that Indigenous people, especially our lot, but Indigenous everywhere, they're practical. They look at things, how to figure out things, common sense, so on and so on. And if you want to look at it like that, rather than great, philosophies and all that kind of stuff, it's there. Land is the fulcrum of everything. And there's more than one fulcrum, of course. Stewardship is probably the governance system, in a sense, which is a different kind of fulcrum too. So if you wanted to sort of look at it in a straightforward, practical way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary.
Can I just say something on the flows? There's this question around how, the rigidity of
Yes.
a bioregion. And it's, I just heard this beautiful yellow-tailed black cockatoo and this beautiful dinosaur-like squawk. If you haven't, if people in the Northern Hemisphere, Google it, because it sounds prehistoric. But this bird, I haven't seen them for months, and they've just come back. The first time I heard them was yesterday. And so the point I'm getting to is that they are flying between different bioregions. And so if we're going to try and quantify what exists in this bioregion or what its carrying capacity is, I think there has to be some level of fluidity to it, because ultimately it's about flows. And where even in catchments, we see the water moving from across bioregions. So I think ultimately, it can be a really valuable tool for people to reconnect and understand more deeply the interdependencies without a sense of rigidity.
And I'm sure if you've read any of Anne Polina's work around the boundaries and borders, lots of people write about this, but of course, Aboriginal people didn't have fences. They didn't have straight lines. They didn't have strict rules about some things. People shared spaces. Some places were, the meeting places. So for the person who asked about those tribal boundaries, as Mary said, firstly, it's a map done by Europeans about very fluid and interconnected places. And I just wanted to mention that one of the most extreme examples of how Westerners think versus how others might think is the native title system. When the Australian legal system finally, reluctantly, got dragged, kicking and screaming, into court by Eddie Mabo, and native title law was acknowledged, the fact that people had a pre-existing legal system, then suddenly the Western system says, you will now draw very, very clear, sharp lines where your land is. You will now identify your apical ancestors. You will now prove. It's just the most. It's a very contentious space.
That's your land. You have to
prove your lineage like a racehorse. Prove
ancient people.
Yeah. And so today, what you see is many Aboriginal people who have been determined as having their own native title to their own places are still deeply unhappy with the lines they had to draw on a map and the division it caused with neighbours and such. So it's a huge issue. Westerners still often find it really difficult to do what Kiran was just saying, thinking fluidly. And I think we're seeing that.
You were cut off. You froze.
I think I think I was okay. I think you froze, Mary. I could see you. Yeah. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
And somebody put into the sidebar. Sorry, I can't see who it is right now. Perhaps Catherine. The Tyson Yunkaporta has talked about these, boundaries between communities or tribes as places of connection, not of separation. So I thought that was a good thing to get into the mix here.
That's right.
Kiran, there was a quite a few questions for you. There were three in particular. I think you started to touch on Michelle Smith's question about expanding on how we could account for social and environmental costs, at least on the quantification side of things when you talked about carrying capacity. Another question that came in from Heather was, curiosity to hear about how some of the residents of Waverley have perceived and experienced the Regen Sydney work, given the material affluence of the area. So those are a couple of the questions. Marco had quite a detailed question about does the indicator of number of families who enjoy not having a car, does it go into detail about what the reasons are for that? So if you could maybe touch on those questions, and I think that will carry us through for a little bit. And then I do have one final question, a really good question that came in to round things out. So Kiran, if you could just maybe briefly touch on those.
I did just notice Carrie's hand up as well, and I wonder, maybe we can get to your question afterwards, Carrie. But yeah, so I think with the quantification of social and ecological indicators, we're thinking that there are, and it came kind of out of my PhD as well, thinking around two potential framings of paradigms for measurement. And I think, of course, there's a really important value for our current modernist institutions to be reined in. And part of that, because they are just completely destroying the planet and in so many ways, as we all know. So part of that is to rein them in. And one really valuable way to do that, I think, is through a deficit-based approach, which is the type of measurement that most of us are familiar with, because you take, for example, the amount of emissions that we can have globally, and then divide that into a chunk that would be applicable to for a population or a geographical context of this size. So that's like apportioning global limits, and you can't do that with all global systems. And Will Steffen, when he was still around, has talked about this, how global systems have to be measured at the global level, specifically because they are global dynamics. But he also placed great value on measurement of locally derived limits as well, based on the dynamics that we see in bioregions as well. So I think still that is the value of quantifying the amount of emissions that the Sydney bioregion can make, for example, or the amount of new land that can be converted or must be reforested. Those are all quantifiable things that we can apply, and that's valuable at larger scales. The other way of measurement that's valuable, which I was describing with the cornerstone indicators, is what I'm calling a strengths-based measurement approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach, and that is less about what are the limits and more about what are the goals that we want to set for ourselves based on values of care and reciprocity and relationality and custodianship. And so that's where these cornerstone indicators are coming from, a place of what a regenerative vision for this neighbourhood is. And those are more deal with bridging the discussion between institutions and the public, and developing, I suppose, bottom-up forms of collective community-led action. I think both those ways of measurement are valuable. And so there's a real question around how and where they can have greatest leverage. So it's still, this is an ongoing conversation. And yeah, did anyone want to riff on that, or I can go on to the next one?
I do.
Could I just make a little comment myself? Oh, sorry. It's about what we're doing, actually. Our lot here on the Gold Coast, and Michelle, we're all working towards this idea and writing about it, to the idea of in local government here, it's often called the council, local government councils, the 3 R's: roads, rates, and rubbish. Well, we're thinking of another R, like you were saying before, regeneration. We're adding stewardship, the concept of stewardship as part of local government, of citizenship. Do you know what I mean? Because I think, Michelle, you were saying, you look up the meaning of what citizenship is. There's hardly anything there. There's hardly any
It's
rights,
the
hardly any
weirdest,
responsibilities.
emptiest concept. Yeah, it's
Empty,
so
like
sad.
an empty. It needs
Yeah.
stewardship to be added to it to give it some real meaning and real doing of things. And a whole lot of people have been talking with over time, over some short time. I think it's a great idea to have something. And I take what you are saying is meaning something like that. And the only thing is missing is all those fantastic things you were talking about, how you did it, how you do it down there in Sydney. It's great. Stewardship.
And I just wanted
you know?
to add, yeah, like I'm excited to be working on that article, which will be part of the book, about the role of obligations in Western society. We love our rights-based approaches, but we very rarely talk about what. And Mary, in longer talks, explains the law of obligation as she articulates it. But just coming back, Kiran, to the mapping and the measuring, it's really interesting. A lot of people worry that too much of the insane obsession with measuring and monitoring and all this is, it's a distraction from the cultural aspects we have to change, whereas others would say we can't do it without it. I believe heavily in a society that's taking too much from the living world needs to be paying attention to what's happening. And so what I would add into the work that you've been talking about is the maps of local places, and particularly how they've changed. Because, and I've talked about this a lot with our own Bioregional webinar series, I'm always picking everyone else's brains. Where do you find your benchmarks? What are you working towards? Because if you don't measure that, there's no end game. And the current problem with sustainability and so many other concepts is Westerners interpret it as continual improvement. It's not. We have to identify what are the benchmarks for ecological health in our place. Then we have to work out how do we fit humans into it. And even if wonderful processes start with humans' vision for stuff and what's our social justice, what is our economy, absolutely. And that's the genuine way to engage people. But unless we embed that into, okay, so what? Now everyone's living well, everyone's socially just, and we have no water to drink and the soils are destroyed. So there's all these layers. It's so complex. If we had governments that cared and put their resources into the nested idea of how we fit ourselves into place and what that looks like. But I'm a great believer in mapping and measuring the visuals of showing people stuff, because most people in our society, our information systems are fractured because of the origins of where information comes from. In Australia, all the data about the natural world originally was how to extract resources from it. And science on biodiversity and caring for places are trying to catch up slowly. And your average human beings in neighbourhoods and communities, they can't point to one place and go, this is our report card for the world that should be here in autumn, the season where the mullet run. This is how our world should look if we decided as a collective what a benchmark looks like. So, sorry, I get very passionate about this, but Western society doesn't seem to have that. That's right. And Mary and others who talk about the whole point of the dreaming, the whole point of the Dreamtime stories is a fantastic book. Can't remember the name. He actually explained that elders told him, and the way that they articulate it, if you put it into Western constructs, it's basically you're born into a place with a budget, an ecological budget. There it is. That's what you've got to look after. That's what you've got. How are you going to look after that for the rest of your lives? Well, you respond, you adapt, you have your culture. But if we're living in a world where we've always seen it as limitless and we always think we can extract and then move on to the moon when we run out of stuff, how the hell are we ever going to get there if we don't know where we're going? So I wholeheartedly love what Kiran's doing too. And I think the measuring, monitoring, it's got to have multiple levels. And not everyone wants to do all the levels, but we all need to be working together on this complex web of redesigning our lives.
Yes.
This is really great. I love the nuance that this is getting to. Thank you for that little riff between the three of you there. We are nearing the end of our time. And so we do have one last question that I think is so good that I can't not ask it. And then we do have a few items of sort of next things that are happening. So for those who can stay on, we would welcome that. Michelle, Mary, Kiran, if you're able to stay on and just answer, maybe a few words about this last question, and then at least for the recording, I'll share what the next events are. But Emily had a question, and maybe each of you could say maybe one thing for this. what small actions can people take today to start living bioregionally? And maybe Mary, start with you, and then Michelle and Kiran to just follow that same order.
Well, I would say something about trying to start with this concept of a stewardship, because it combines two things. But to understand how it combines, though, too, it's beyond just conservation and things like that. It's about what kind of country you want to live in, where do you stand in things, in relation to the terrible things going on in the world today, in our own countries, but elsewhere. So, it is a straight connection from the looking after the land and understanding what ethics and conscience is. Because to me, I'm really, because my own background, it's political science, it's terrifying to look at the world today. To me, I can't help but see it as the rise of uncivilization. It's rising and rising. Do you know what I mean? So we're looking at civilization, really. And, the whole thing of looking after the land is supposed to be, it's not just not just an end in itself. It's a guide, it's a track towards how to live a civilized life, really. And I know I toss this word around and so on, but it means cease to be indifferent to what's going on in the world. Don't be indifferent. Oh, well, we're doing our own thing and we're going to save this region or this country and so on. Because another way of looking at our own old system is, the difference between a unipolar world is an empire, a bipolar, it sounds strange, bipolar world is a big fight between two huge empires, and a multipolar world, which is what a lot of countries want now, is where every country's sovereignty is a protected thing. You cannot invade anybody else's sovereignty, and so on and so on. It's a multipolarity, it's called, a multipolar world. Well, you look at Australia, and although we're talking about bioregionalism, that is a multipolarity in one country.
It totally is.
So,
and Mary,
or you can call, you can call it it's multipolarity with Aboriginal characteristics, which I often think. So you can put it anyway, but that's actually what it is. I would love to see that coming into being. All these different countries own themselves; they're their own boss. That's how it's got to be, First of all.
thanks, Mary. And I'll give my quick takeaway. Building on what Mary just said about contemplating stewardship and really deeply understanding what that means. May I, at a personal level, invite people who, and I'm sure you already do this, but go outside at the same time every day, to the same place every day, for a certain amount of time every day, and either with a journal or with your own mind, observe who's out there with you. Watch where the sun is, where the moon is. I'm a gardener. I also do tons of bushwalking, but that's a kind of white fella escape into, if you've got to go to the same place all the time to really see who's there and to watch country. And like with me, everyone knows I'm obsessed with blue-banded bees. We have 1,900 species of native bees in Australia. I have to put bee stories in somewhere. You have to hear this. So every morning, the same time, morning and afternoon, I go out to my garden and I actually sit and talk to the bees and I check in. And exactly like Kiran, I heard black cockatoos yesterday for the first time in months. So they're obviously moving across country. Stewardship is the idea of not just being part of it, but doing things to look after it. And what I have done is turn my suburban lawn into full natives and a few Euroflowers. And now I've counted 9 species of native bees, teddy bear bees, blue-banded bees, the little black and white bees, as well as all your Euro bees. So getting to know even one little pocket of place. I mean, that's what Aboriginal people did for millennia, was to observe their local areas, and they knew when everything was happening. To me, that's my invitation to you. Once you think that way, and everyone thinks that way, you cannot make decisions in your day-to-day lives that can go, well, let's just wreck that place because those bees and those trees don't matter. I think if you connect and see that seasonal change, that's the joy of bioregional living, I think. So over to you, Kiran.
Yeah, really, really similar. I think, drawing inspiration from something Jason said to me, Jason from Cooks River Alliance the other day, but it's if everyone knew the path that water takes from their home to the ocean, then I think we would have a much greater idea of the other aspects of the watershed that we're connecting with, essentially, because that water is connecting us with everything else on its path to the ocean. So, you know, if you could go out there and follow the path that a raindrop would take down to your local river, and then follow that down to as far as you can get close to your ocean, then I think that would be a good way to connect.
Here, and I think we need a little animation to promote bioregional thinking in Australia. We should do a little animated water drop and where it's going. Anyway, sorry, back to you, Bill.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mary, Michelle, and Kiran. I'll thank you again before we end out, but I just wanted to end this section, and also thank you to all of you who asked questions. And those of you who we couldn't get to the questions, apologies for that. I do track them and can share that with the speakers in case we have an opportunity to get to some of those answers afterwards. But just for the very last little bit here, if folks can stay on board, I did want to share just what things look like going forward from here. So the first thing is actually very soon is a webinar that actually we're not hosting, that Michelle is hosting, part of her Explore Bioregioning series that AELA hosts, AELA. And this is Stories from the Mystic River that I will be appearing in, talking about the global work that we at R3.0 do and that I do on a bioregional basis here in the forests of the Northeast. And joined by three of my colleagues who are operating here in that same bioregion through the Alliance for the Mystic River Watershed. That's Brenda Gear and Mike Thomas from two of the Pequot tribal nations, the Mashantucket Pequot and the Eastern Pequot, and then Maggie Favretti talking about the co-governance that they do between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in that Mystic River watershed. So that's happening next week, the 24th of April for you all, and 23rd of April for us here in the Americas, Turtle Island. The next open dialogue that we have is on bioregional governance, which perhaps couldn't be more appropriate than that to follow on this session. And so this is featuring Sarah Queblatin from the Philippines, who's just worked on a report on bioregional governance in Asia and the Pacific that just came out from Ecolease. Ted Rao, a good friend of mine, we used to live in the same co-housing community together, where he started Sociocracy for All with his partner, Jerry Cook Gonzalez. And so Ted will be talking about sociocracy applied to the bioregional context. And finally, Austin Wade Smith, who's the executive director of Regen Foundation, which we have close ties with Regen Foundation. Will Zoll, their chair, sits on our steering board, and they serve as the fiscal sponsor of our grant that is underwriting our bioregional work. So Austin has really been thinking about bioregional governance, and in particular, what he calls ecological institutions, or institutions that encompass the rights of the more than human community. So that'll be a date and time to be determined. So keep your eyes out for that. We don't have the next bioregional carrying capacities session set yet, but I do know it's going to be with researchers from the University of Washington applying the planetary boundaries to the Cascadia bioregion, and then partners of ours from the University of Guelph in the greater Takaranto bioregion talking about their literature review of bioregional carrying capacities. So keep your eyes out for that one as well. This is our landing page on open dialogues on bioregioning on our website, so you can get information about all of these. And we will post the recording and the deck and other materials for this session that we've just participated in on that landing page. Here's our landing page for the bioregional carrying capacities sessions. So you can also get to it on the bioregioning tab on our website. Finally, last thing to say here is that we've got the 12th International R3.0 conference coming up in September, the 9th and 10th. It's all online, and the tagline of it is braiding bioregional resilience and regeneration, learning to re-inhabit Earth together. And Michelle will actually be speaking in that conference in the first session on bioregional Earth and looking at the tapestry of bioregions that are weaving together globally. Two other quick things here. One is that we are inviting, since the conference is online, we're inviting bioregions to host confluences. So that's in-person gatherings of various different sizes for the bioregion to both experience the conference content together, but also do their own autonomous gathering and governance work. And then on the 11th of September, the day after the conferences, we will have a bioregional confluence global debrief day. So on the 11th and actually on the 18th as well, for all of those confluences that are taking place in time zones where it's not convenient to watch the conference in real time. So we're trying to be accommodating of the global reach of the conference. And we've created a guidance document for that, and we're hosting a series of guidance calls. We've had our first one, and our next one is, I believe, next week, and the 22nd, and then on the 14th of May. And so this is guidance for doing this confluencing, which ultimately we see moving towards a revitalization of the act of bioregional congressing, or getting together to both gather and also conduct governance in person on a bioregional basis, and then in coming years, a continental basis, which has a practice in North America or Turtle Island going back to the 80s, and then ultimately a planetary scale bioregional congressing. So that's some of the work that you can tap into. I want to thank you all for being here today and participating in this really quite dynamic session. I want to end just by again thanking our speakers, Mary, Michelle, Kiran. Really deepest gratitude for what you've shared.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for attending, bringing your energy and also your great questions. So thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
everyone.
much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bringing us together.
Bye.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, Michelle. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.